My reading partner and I have reached the book of Exodus. And remember, at the beginning of the book of Exodus, the people of Israel are growing in number. Then a new Pharaoh comes along who didn't know Joseph, and so he decrees that all of the baby boys should be killed so that the population of Israel would decline. But the Hebrew midwives don't comply with his plan, and a baby is born, Moses, who winds up living in Pharaoh's house and being raised as his son. And then Moses makes some poor decisions, and that results in him fleeing from Egypt and winding up in the desert in Midian. And in the beginning of chapter 3 of Exodus, this is what we read. Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses, and he said, Here I am. And if you're familiar with that chapter, perhaps you, like me, for a long time, the thing that stood out was the fact that there was this bush burning, but not burning up. And I don't know where recently, within the last few years, it came to my attention. Maybe it was on a video devotion that somebody did. Maybe it was a life group question. But there's a very key point to be made in this passage, and that is that God didn't speak to Moses until Moses turned aside. Moses was on his way. He saw this bush, and he could have gone right on, like, oh, that's kind of curious, and gone on. But he said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him. And I think that's probably an apt parallel to some of our lives today. We're going about our business, and God is doing things, but we don't always turn aside. And because we don't always turn aside, because we don't always interrupt what our intended path was, because we don't often take the time to see what God is doing, to look for what God is doing, to explore what God is doing, we don't hear God speak. Moses heard God speak because he turned aside, because he interrupted his plans and took notice of what God was doing. And I would encourage us today to take some time to turn aside, to look around, to investigate what God is doing. And I believe that, like Moses, we will hear God speak, maybe not in an audible voice as Moses did, but through that voice of the Holy Spirit, through the pages of his word. I believe we will hear God speak when we turn aside to investigate and listen.